They say death comes in the quiet, but for Ethan, it arrived with the violent buzz of a smartphone at 2:14 a.m. The blue light of the screen sliced through the darkness of his Seattle apartment, stinging his eyes. 5 missed calls, all from Claire. Ethan's heart didn't just skip a beat, it sank into his stomach. In the modern world, nobody calls 5 times after midnight unless the world is ending. He swiped accept with a trembling thumb. Claire? Her voice was a ragged whisper broken by a sob she was trying to swallow. It's Dad. The doctors, they said he's entered the final stage. His kidneys are failing. They don't think he'll make it through the next 48 hours. Ethan sat bolt upright, the cold air of the room hitting his skin. He looked out the window. The street lights were blurred by a torrential downpour, a storm the news had been calling the Great Freeze. I'll book the first flight out, Ethan said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. You can't, Claire choked out. The storm has grounded everything. SeaTac is closed, Portland is closed. They've cancelled every flight heading south for the next 2 days. Ethan, the roads are the only way, but the weather is turning into a nightmare. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the static of a long-distance connection. Ethan hadn't spoken to David in 5 years. The last time they were in the same room, glass had shattered and words were exchanged that could never be taken back. He had spent half a decade building a life in Seattle, a life made of glass and steel and silence, specifically to forget the man in Texas who smelled like grease and old Marlboros. But now the silence was about to become permanent. I'm coming, Ethan said, his jaw tightening. I'm driving. Ethan, it's over 1,300 miles, through the mountains, through the ice. You'll never make it in time. I have to, he snapped, more to himself than to her. Tell him, just tell him to wait, please Claire, tell him to wait. He hung up. The silence of the apartment was suddenly deafening. Ethan moved like a ghost. He threw a week's worth of clothes into a duffel bag. He didn't grab his laptop or his charger. He grabbed his keys and an old, crumpled photograph he kept hidden in the back of his desk drawer. A picture of a 6-year-old Ethan sitting on the hood of a 1969 Mustang, his father's grease-stained hand resting proudly on his shoulder. He ran to the garage. His SUV roared to life, the headlights cutting through the gloom like 2 desperate eyes. As he pulled out onto the I-5 South, the GPS gave him the grim reality. 22 hours and 14 minutes to Austin, Texas. That was in perfect conditions, and tonight the world was anything but perfect. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so hard, his knuckles turned white. He wasn't just racing against the storm, he was racing against a lifetime of I'm sorries that had been buried too deep for too long. He pushed the accelerator down. The city lights of Seattle began to fade in the rearview mirror, replaced by the endless swallowing blackness of the open highway. Just wait for me, Dad, he whispered into the dark. Don't you dare leave before I get there.
By 4 a.m., the neon glow of the city had long since surrendered to the suffocating blackness of the Washington wilderness. The rain wasn't just falling anymore, it was an assault. It hammered against the roof of Ethan's SUV like thousands of tiny, insistent fingers trying to get in. Ethan reached for the radio, desperate to drown out the sound of his own thoughts. He hit scan. The static hissed, a ghostly white noise, until it finally caught a signal. A low, gravelly country song filled the cabin. It was an old track by Waylon Jennings, one of his father's favorites. Ethan's hand froze on the dial. He hadn't heard this song in years. Suddenly, he wasn't on a rain-slicked highway in the middle of the night. The smell of the wet pavement was replaced by the scent of warm motor oil and sun-baked dust. Flashback 1. The driving lesson. He was 16 again. His feet could barely reach the pedals of his father's prized 1969 Mustang. David was sitting in the passenger seat, his arm resting on the open window, a faint smile hidden behind his thick beard. Easy on the clutch, Ethan, David had said, his voice deep and steady, the kind of voice that made you feel like nothing in the world could ever truly go wrong. An R isn't just a machine, it's a conversation. You listen to what it's telling you, and you respond. Don't fight it. Ethan had stalled the engine for the 10th time, his face burning with frustration. I can't do this, Dad. It's too much to keep track of. David didn't get angry. He never did back then. He just reached over, placed a rough, calloused hand on Ethan's shoulder, and said, "The road is long, son. You're gonna make mistakes. You're gonna stall. The trick isn't being perfect. It's having the heart to turn the key and start again." Back to present. A sudden gust of wind slammed into the side of the SUV, jolting Ethan back to the present. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his palms ached. That steady, patient man from his childhood felt like a stranger now. How had they gone from those quiet afternoons in the garage to 5 years of cold, bitter silence? The fatigue was starting to set in. His eyelids felt heavy, like they were lined with lead. He looked at the dashboard clock, 4:42 a.m. He had been driving for over 2 hours, but the GPS showed he had barely made a dent in the journey. The time to destination sat at a cruel 20 hours. Ethan reached into the passenger seat to grab a bottle of water, and his hand brushed against a stack of papers he had shoved into the glove box months ago. Letters. He pulled one out at a red light in a small, sleeping town. The envelope was yellowed, addressed in his father's shaky, uneven handwriting. Ethan had never opened them. Every time one arrived in Seattle, he had looked at the return address, Austin, Texas, and felt a surge of that old, familiar anger. He had tucked them away, a debt he refused to pay. Now, under the dim amber glow of the cabin light, he stared at his father's script. He wanted to rip it open. He wanted to know what his father had tried to say during those 5 years of exile, but he was terrified. What if the letters were full of more judgment? Or worse, what if they were full of love he didn't deserve? The light turned green. Ethan shoved the letter back into the glove box. Not yet. He couldn't break down yet. The road ahead began to climb. He was hitting the mountain passes now. The rain was turning into a slushy, treacherous mix of ice and snow. The SUV's tires struggled for grip on the black ice. Every slide, every shudder of the frame felt like a warning. He thought about Claire's voice on the phone. They don't think he'll make it through the next 48 hours. Ethan's foot pressed harder on the gas. He was tired, he was scared, and for the first time in his life, he realized that he didn't just want to see his father, he needed to. He needed to tell him that he had finally learned how to listen to the car. He had learned how to turn the key and start again. But as the temperature gauge on the dashboard dropped and the wind howled through the pines, a dark thought crept into his mind. What if the road is too long this time?
The SUV didn't just stop, it died. Ethan watched in horror as thick white smoke billowed from under the hood, illuminated by his headlights against the pitch-black sky of the Wyoming plains. He steered the coasting vehicle onto the narrow shoulder, the gravel crunching under the tires like breaking bones. "No, no, no, not now, not today!" Ethan screamed, slamming his palms against the steering wheel. He stepped out of the car. The wind hit him like a physical blow, bitter, dry, and smelling of nothingness. He was in the middle of nowhere. No streetlights, no houses, just miles of empty highway and a ticking clock that was laughing at him. He popped the hood. A cloud of scalding steam hissed into his face. In the dim light of his phone's flashlight, he saw it. A burst radiator hose. A simple piece of rubber had just become a wall between him and his dying father. Ethan sank to his knees on the cold asphalt. The silence of the plains was terrifying. He checked his phone. No service. He was an architect. He designed skyscrapers. He lived in a world of clean lines, digital models, and glass offices. But here, on the side of a highway, his degree was worthless. He needed to be a mechanic. He needed to be like David. Desperate, he reached into the back of the SUV and found an old emergency toolkit his father had forced him to keep years ago. As he started working, trying to patch the hose with whatever he could find, the cold began to numb his fingers. He reached deep into the engine bay, his hands scraping against jagged metal. When he pulled them out, they were covered in it. Grease. Deep, black, stubborn engine grease. It was under his nail fingers and smeared across his palms. Ethan froze. He stared at his hands. For a decade, he had spent a fortune on soaps and lotions to keep his hands soft, to erase any sign that he had grown up in a dusty garage in Texas. He had hated the way his father's hands always looked, permanently stained, smelling of gasoline and tobacco. But now, looking at the black oil on his own skin, a sob escaped his throat. He looked exactly like David. Flashback 2. The last argument. The air in the garage had been thick with tension, heavier than the humidity of a Texas July. David was under a truck, his legs sticking out, his voice muffled. "You're throwing it all away, Ethan," David had said. "Architecture? You're going to spend your life drawing lines on paper for people who don't care about you? You belong here. This shop is a legacy." Ethan, 22 and full of arrogance, had laughed. "Legacy? The shop is a tomb, Dad. You're stuck in the past. You're old-fashioned and you're small. I want to build things the world actually sees. I'm not spending my life covered in dirt like you." David had slid out of under the truck. He didn't yell. He just stood there, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag that was already black. His eyes weren't angry. They were hollow. "Dirt washes off, Ethan, but loneliness, that stays. You think you're building a future, but you're just building a wall. One day you're going to look back, and the road is going to be very, very long. I hope you have the heart for it." Ethan had walked out without a word. He hadn't looked back, not once. Back to present. Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of black grease across his forehead. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty highway. "You were right. The road is so long." With a desperation he had never felt before, he used a roll of heavy-duty tape and a piece of plastic tubing from his luggage to bypass the leak. His movements were frantic but focused. He wasn't thinking like an architect anymore. He was thinking like the boy who used to hold the flashlight for his father. He climbed back into the driver's seat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned the key. The engine coughed. It sputtered. It died. "Please," Ethan begged, his forehead resting on the steering wheel. "Please, just give me 800 more miles. That's all I need. Just let me say it." He turned the key again. The engine roared to life. It sounded rough, and the temperature gauge stayed dangerously close to the red line, but it was moving. Ethan pulled back onto the highway. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, a pale, cold purple light. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel, black and bruised. He didn't want to wash them. For the first time in 5 years, he felt like he was finally carrying a piece of his father with him. But the time to destination on his GPS still read 14 hours. And Claire's last text, which had finally come through with a bar of service, sent a chill down his spine that no heater could fix. "He's drifting in and out, Ethan. He's asking for you. Hurry."
The world was changing. The jagged, snow-capped peaks of the north had flattened into the endless rolling plains of the Midwest, and now, as the sun climbed higher, the air turned from a biting chill to a heavy, suffocating heat. Ethan's SUV felt like a rolling furnace. The air conditioner had died somewhere in Colorado, but he didn't care. He didn't even roll down the windows, he just drove. His eyes were no longer just tired, they were screaming. They felt like they were filled with hot sand. Every time he blinked, it felt like his eyelids were made of sandpaper. He was in the trance now, that dangerous hypnotic state where the white lines on the road start to look like snakes slithering under the car. He had been awake for nearly 30 hours. His hands were still stained with the black grease from the radiator repair, the oil now baked into his skin by the sun. His phone buzzed in the center console. He didn't even have to look to know who it was. "Claire," he croaked. His voice was so dry it sounded like rust. "Claire, where are you?" Claire's voice was different now. The panic had been replaced by a terrifying, hollow calmness. That was the sound of someone who had already started grieving. "The doctors, they've started him on a morphine drip, Ethan. He's not awake anymore. He's just breathing. It's shallow. Every breath sounds like a struggle. He kept calling your name an hour ago. He thought the nurse was you."
Ethan gripped the steering wheel so hard the cheap plastic groaned. A single tear escaped his swollen eye, carving a clean path through the dust and grease on his cheek. "Tell him I'm right there. Tell him I'm coming around the corner. Lie to him if you have to, Claire. Just don't let him go yet." "Hurry, Ethan," she whispered, and the line went dead. He looked at the horizon. The sky was a brutal, shimmering blue. The landscape was a blur of brown dirt, scrub brush, and rusted barbed wire fences. This was David's country. This was the land Ethan had fought so hard to escape. He had hated the slowness of it, the heat, the way everyone seemed content with just getting by. But now, as he sped past the rotting remains of old farmhouses and abandoned gas stations, he felt a strange, crushing nostalgia. He passed a sign for a diner they used to visit when he was a kid. He remembered the taste of the cherry pie, the way David would ruffle his hair and tell him he was smart enough to build the whole world. David hadn't wanted Ethan to stay in the garage because he wanted him to hold him back. He wanted him to stay because he knew the world outside was cold. He knew that skyscrapers and glass offices don't love you back when your heart is breaking. Ethan's foot pressed the accelerator until it hit the floorboards. The engine was vibrating violently now. The temporary patch on the radiator hose was holding, but the engine was screaming in protest. "Just a little further," Ethan whispered, his head nodding off for a split second before he jerked it back up. He started to hallucinate. He saw David sitting in the passenger seat, not the dying man in the hospital bed, but the David from the Mustang, vibrant, strong, smelling of old leather. "You're pushing it too hard, son. You're gonna burn the engine out before you reach the gate," the ghost of David seemed to say. "I have to reach the gate, Dad," Ethan said out loud to the empty car. "I have to tell you." The miles began to melt away, but so did Ethan's grip on reality. The highway signs became a blur of unreadable symbols. He was no longer driving a car, he was driving his soul across 1,000 miles of asphalt. He passed the Welcome to Texas sign at 4:15 p.m. The heat haze shimmered off the road like a lake of fire. He was less than 3 hours away, but 3 hours felt like 3 years. His phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call, it was a text. "Ethan, please, now." He didn't reply. He didn't have the words left. He just shifted his gaze back to the road, his vision narrowing until the whole world was nothing but a thin strip of gray pavement leading into a setting sun that looked like a bleeding wound. He wasn't an architect anymore. He wasn't a success. He was just a boy, covered in his father's grease, desperate to reach home before the lights went out for good.
The SUV died the moment it touched the pavement of the St. Jude's Memorial parking lot. It was as if the machine had made a silent pact with Ethan. It would get him there, but not a single inch further. Ethan didn't even take the keys out of the ignition. He pushed the door open, his legs nearly buckling as his feet hit the ground. His body was a map of the last 26 hours. His clothes were stiff with dried sweat. His face was masked in dust, and his hands were still stained with the black, stubborn grease of his father's world. He didn't walk, he stumbled. The automatic glass doors of the hospital hissed open, and the blast of sterile, antiseptic chilled air hit him like a bucket of ice water. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The sound of his sneakers on the polished linoleum floor echoed through the silent lobby. He didn't stop at the front desk. He didn't ask for directions. He knew. Deep in his gut, he could feel the pull toward the 4th floor. He skipped the elevator and took the stairs, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 4th floor, oncology, room 402. He turned the corner into the hallway and stopped. There, standing outside a door at the far end of the hall, was Claire. She looked small. She was leaning against the wall, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, rhythmic sobs. Ethan's world slowed down. Every footstep felt like he was walking through deep water. "Claire," he whispered. She looked up. Her eyes were red, her face puffy.
When she saw him, covered in grease, exhausted, trembling, she didn't say a word. She just moved aside and opened the door. The sound of a rhythmic mechanical hiss, the oxygen concentrator, and the steady, slow pulse, pulse, pulse of a heart monitor. The room was dim, lit only by the orange glow of a setting Texas sun bleeding through the blinds. And there, in the center of it all, was David. But it wasn't the David Ethan remembered. The man in the bed was a shadow. His once broad shoulders had vanished. His skin was the color of old parchment. He looked like a traveler who had gone too far and was finally, desperately looking for a place to sit down. Ethan approached the bed, his knees hitting the floor. He took his father's hand. It was cold, so cold. "Dad," Ethan choked out. The word felt like it was tearing his throat apart. "Dad, it's me. It's Ethan. I'm here. I'm finally here." For a long, terrifying minute, there was no response, just the hiss of the machine. Then, slowly, David's eyelids flickered. He turned his head, his eyes clouding with the fog of morphine and the coming darkness. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the grease under Ethan's fingernails. He looked at the black streaks on his son's forehead. A tiny, almost invisible smile touched David's lips. He didn't have the strength to speak. He didn't have the breath to say, "I forgive you." He didn't need to. David reached out with a trembling hand and squeezed Ethan's grease-stained fingers. It was the same squeeze from the Mustang, the same steady, silent reassurance that said, "The road is long, but you made it home." A single tear rolled down David's cheek, catching the golden light of the sunset. "I'm sorry," Ethan sobbed, burying his face in the bedsheets. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. Please, please don't go yet. I have so much to tell you." David's grip tightened for 1 second, a final surge of life, and then his hand went limp. "Dad?" Ethan looked up. "Dad!" The nurses rushed in, but Ethan didn't move. He sat there, clutching that cold, still hand, as the sun finally sank below the horizon, plunging the room into darkness. He had driven 1,000 miles for a goodbye, and he had arrived just in time to watch the light go out. An hour later, after the machines were turned off and the room had grown quiet, Claire came back in. She handed Ethan a small wooden box from the bedside table. "He wanted you to have this," she said softly. Ethan opened it. Inside was the crumpled photograph from the garage, the one of 6-year-old Ethan and David by the Mustang. But there was something else, a small, yellowed envelope. Ethan opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a note written in David's shaky hand just weeks before his voice had failed him. It read, "Ethan, I know you're building big things up there. I hope they make you happy. But remember, a house is just glass and stone. A home is where someone is waiting for you. I kept the engine running as long as I could, son. I waited every day. I love you, Dad." Ethan collapsed. He sat on the floor of room 402, clutching that note to his chest, and cried, not like an architect, not like a success, but like the little boy who just wanted his father to teach him how to drive one more time. The silence of the hospital was absolute. Outside, the Texas stars began to come out, cold and distant, shining down on a man who had finally finished his journey, only to realize he had nowhere left to go.